Hello, and welcome to this tutorial for entering variable overhead expenses into our Labor Pricing for a Profit version 6.0 software. Entering variable overhead is very similar to entering fixed overhead expenses with one exception. By definition, variable overhead expenses are tied directly to productivity. That is, if we send a technician out in the field to do some work today, we're going to incur that expense. There are very few variable overhead expenses. Typically, there's only 4 or 5. And usually these are going to be fuel for the trucks, maintenance on our trucks, maybe permits, fees specifically for jobs that they're doing, merchant fees, in other words, the more service calls the guys run, possibly the more customers will pay with credit card, therefore more merchant fees that we will incur. Possibly dumping fees, getting rid of garbage for specific jobs. Those are things that will increase as the work in the field increases as well. This being the case, we're going to tie these expenses directly to productivity. Let's get started. To enter variable overhead expenses, we'll simply click on the Costs Input icon in the Setup area of the left-hand toolbar. As soon as we click on that, the Cost Setup window opens up, and again, over on the right-hand side, we can see the various different types of overhead expenses. We'll be entering variable overhead, so we'll click on the radio button for variable overhead. As soon as we do that, the Cost Setup window will reconfigure itself specifically for entering variable overhead. Now, entering this type of overhead expense is very, very simple. To get started, all we need to do is to click on the New icon. As soon as we do that, the Variable Cost Setup window will open up. And we only have to enter in a couple of pieces of information for each of these variable overhead items. So let's go ahead and enter an expense for gasoline. Now, for variable overhead expenses, all we have to do is enter in the annual cost, the total annual cost for that particular expense. So for fuel, we have total annual costs of $15,000. And again, for comments, you can put anything in here that you want. Okay, and then we'll hit our Tab key. Now, as soon as we do that, you will notice that our monthly allocation starts to be calculated. We've got in the first column the billable hours as you defined when you entered in your labor and defined what you had for billable hours for each of your direct labor employees. The software then immediately uses that and spreads our monthly allocation for this variable expense accordingly. You can see that the months that have a higher number of billable hours will have a greater amount allocated to it for this particular expense, tallying up with the grand total, in our case, of $15,000 for this expense for the entire year. Now, the next step that we have to do is, again, allocate these expenses to our various departments. So in our particular case, we're going to spread this overhead based on the number of trucks that we have. And 45% of our trucks are in our service department. 50% of our trucks are in our installation department, and 5% is for the retail store. Now, one final note regarding variable expenses. Remember that variable costs are allocated to the departments based on the percentages that you entered in the variable overhead allocation section above. These costs are allocated to specific months within each department based on the timing of the billable hours throughout the year. So again, the more hours that you have in a given department, the more dollars will be allocated to that given department based on the percentages that you entered in the variable overhead allocation section. Now that we're complete, we can click on Accept, and once again click on New to simply add our next variable overhead expense. Thank you for watching this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll get into entering our materials into the software. Thank you.